All right. So it's about 102. We can get started. Welcome to the virtual programming provided by Plano Public Library. Thank you so much for joining us, especially during the lunch hour. Hopefully you have already had something to eat and have enough energy in the brain. But if you have not, then we'll have fun this hour, and then we can all go up to munch something. I personally have my meal waiting for me in the fridge, so I can't wait to get to that. Now, today's program is going to be mostly a lecture and kind of an extended brainstorming. My name is Evan. I'm based at Schimmelfinnig Library on Custer and Spring Creek. I have a few colleagues joining me today. Miss Jamie Eastman from Harrington, who has been very helpful in helping me putting together handouts, which will be sent to your email address and will be available online. It has a list of resources related to writing, as well as today's topic. She'll also be helping me with the lecture today, in case my technology is messing up, then Miss Jamie may have to step in. I also have Miss Sabrina and Mr. Bob from Haggard Library, who's here to also assist with technology. So I think we'll have a smooth day. Now, as I mentioned, it's going to be mostly a lecture, not a lot of exercises, but there will be a Q&A section toward the very end. And I was telling people who have joined earlier that if time permits, I may have time to talk about how to get published or how to get noticed by publishers and agents. Hopefully we can get to that. If not, that might be a nice program to stand alone by itself. All right. Even though there's a Q&A section at the very end, feel free to ask any urgent questions as we go. My colleagues can always notify me and we can pause the lecture and answer those. So today, we're going to talk about the manipulation of time. And really, it's just a form of storytelling. And hopefully by the end of the lecture today, we'll have the clear understanding of the relationship between time and story. I'd like to start with a movie. So imagine this. This is nearly the first scene, or really the first act of the movie. It shows the dawn of human beings when we were still apes, were covered in fur. And then one tribe of those early humans was able to secure a water source because they started using tools. They came upon this dead animal and used their bones as weapons. So they used those bones to defeat the surrounding tribes, and they came on top. So in celebration, the leader of this tribe, the leader of this pack, really, tossed the bone right up in the air in sheer joy. And the camera just follows it, going up, 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 as the bone is spinning and spinning and spinning, and it goes all the way to the top of the curve, and the bone starts falling, and it falls to the bottom of the screen, and the scene cuts to a man-made satellite. Now imagine the implication here. In the blink of an eye, we literally crossed 40,000 years from the dawn of human beings all the way to a near future sci-fi setting. And they are connected because satellites surround the Earth simply because they keep falling into Earth. It's the same motion, the same gravitational pull. It's just that they never actually hit the ground. So this scene right here, I'm pretty sure some of you have already recognized it. It's from one of the greatest movies ever made, 2001, A Space Odyssey. It's a science fiction film, but the very first scene is set in the distant past. Now, why is that scene so powerful? The elephant in the room is time. The difference in time between this scene and the very next scene where you see a scientist going toward a colony in the moon, that's clearly beyond our time. And by the way, this movie came out 1 year before the moon landing. So a very imaginative film there. So from here, perhaps we can derive at a theory about time and story, which is that drama comes from the disparity of time. Drama comes from the disparity of time. When we are putting things into words, when we're writing a story, we always have to manipulate time in some way. And because that time is always different from how we experience them as biological creatures, there's always going to be a disparity. You know, we always wait in anticipation. Some of you may have recognized that that little trick from Rocky Horror Picture Show. So this character suddenly paused in the middle of a sentence. In fact, in the middle of the word anticipation. And because of the dramatic pause, audience is waiting for the second half of the word, and it just so happens to be anticipation. We're anticipating the end of the word. So as you can see, this very simple trick, a pause in time, gives us so much drama in such a short time. It relates to how you make transitions in your stories as well. I'm pretty sure for you avid readers out there, and you should be an avid reader if you want to be a writer, by the way. You see that between scenes, there may be a blank line, for example. Or in the middle of the chapter, the author would pause and say, okay, now we're at a different location. Those transition sentences, they almost always make a skip on the timeline. And every time it does that, it resets the stories. It resets the story and resets the reader's expectation. It gives you a clean scratch. So that drama of basically, quote unquote, turning the page is what makes the story go forward. Now, let's take a look at how that works in practice. All right. When we're reading a story, the time that the reader experiences is often different from the time that's fictionalized in the story. Let's first just take a look at how we experience time, right? You see in this chart, I have a series of different forms of literature according to length. The shortest flash fiction, they may just be 100 words, up to maybe just a couple thousand words. You take maybe from seconds to a few minutes to finish reading them. So if we're going to translate that into a more visual media, they're just like commercial clips, the advertisement you see on TV during the halftime of Super Bowl. Longer than that, we have short stories. They would usually take, say, between 30 minutes to finish reading or to an hour to 2 hours. Usually they can be read within one sitting. So they're like a feature film, but they're more like a standalone episode from a TV series. Now, imagine the difference here. When we're reading things that can be read in one sitting, then you're getting that holistic experience. By the time you reach the ending, you still remember the beginning. So this entire thing has to be well self-packaged. Everything has to work in one single note. That's especially true for flash fiction, but short stories to a large extent, that's true as well. Just think about all the great short stories that we have read. Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin, for example. At the very beginning, we see a wife who receives the news that her husband has passed away in a train accident. And towards the very end of the story, it still recalls that news from the beginning. And without it, the story wouldn't work. Going longer than that, we have novellas. They're shorter than novels, but longer than short stories. And from here, they may take 2 to 3 sittings. Not a large project, but not a lot of people can read it in one sitting either. So they're like a theatrical play or one of those early films that actually has an intermission in between them. That means the writer of this novella would have to be very tactful on when to place that break. If they want to have a time skip, that may be happening in the middle, right in the middle of the novella, so they encourage readers to use that time to take a break. Longer than that, of course, we have novels, and they require several sittings. They can span across the week, or for a slower reader, it would even be much longer. So there'll be TV series, and with breaks in between episodes and even seasons. And because the reader has much more time in between sessions, they have to think about it more. That gives them more time for reflection. This is often why you see novels having more complex themes compared to short stories, because they allow the readers to have time to think. It's as simple as that. Even longer than that, we have serials that as the reader's life goes on, if they get invested into a novel that gets, maybe one chapter published per week, per month, then the progression of life and the progression of the time within the story go parallel. So this is a long period of committed discussion and encourages a lot of interaction within the community. All right, so this is half of the puzzle, the experience of time from the reader's point of view. Then let's take a look at the other half, which is the fictionalized time span. I have a few examples here. I may not be able to go through all of them in detail, but let's take a look. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge is a short story. It's set in the Civil War, during the Civil War era, and it's by Ambrose Bierce. So it's a stream of conscious story showing how after a captured soldier is getting hanged, the rope somehow miraculously broke. So he was able to escape. He ran through fields as people were firing guns after him, and he goes into a creek, swims, runs, and finally reaches home where a loved one is waiting for him and gave him a hot meal. And then at the very end of the story, we return to the scene at the execution stand. And it implies that this entire story, which takes 24 minutes to read, happened all within a split of a second. When that realization kicks in, that disparity of time that I just mentioned really hits you hard. Think about the implication that you had an extra half an hour of life all through the imagination, and think about the despair when that finally kicks in. Now, on the opposite end, we have something that's supposed to happen for longer, story of an hour that I just mentioned, that it's supposed to take 1 hour within the story, but it only takes about 4 minutes to read. So you can see the main character's emotion roller coaster going up and down within the hour, all squeezed into 4 minutes, and it's just so much more intense. On the opposite end, we have things like Ulysses, which is about 600, 700 pages. It's a gigantic book. It takes 19 hours to read, and I highly doubt if anybody can finish reading Ulysses within 19 hours because the writing is very complex. But the story just so happens to also take place within 19 hours. So the author, James Joyce, is trying to make a point there by deliberately matching the reading time and the fictional time. And this is very unusual. We can see other things like, for instance, One Piece is a serialized manga, comic book that's started all the way back in the 20th century. So it's been 20 plus years that's been serializing every week. And within the story, only 3 years have passed. And if you want to catch up with the story, you need to spend 150 hours. So it's an epic regardless. Also in this epic, Moby Dick also takes about 3 years within the story and takes 14 hours to complete. So you get more of the dramatic experience. But then you see something like 100 Years of Solitude. Now, this is interesting because 100 years is longer than the lifespan of a human being. So everything before it, even for something like Moby Dick, that's obviously an epic, that does not compare to when we have to absorb everything that's happened from a time period that's literally longer than we can ever experience. So 100 Years of Solitude by Nobel Prize winner Gabriel Garcia Marquez, it takes just about 8 hours to complete. So imagine the condensation of the emotion and the drama in that book. Even more so, we have Death's End from Chinese sci-fi writer Liu Cixin. This novel covers the lifetime of the universe. And we can get to it a little bit later in the slides. So let me stop talking about it for now. We can discuss it more in detail of how he pulls that off. All right. Now I mentioned 100 Years of Solitude. So let's take a moment to appreciate this sentence here. Many years later, as he faced a firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. This is the very first sentence of the novel. Let's see why it's so great. It's considered one of the greatest sentences ever written. Well, I made this little diagram here. Let's imagine that the star is where we started at the very beginning. Let me see if I can get a little pen out here. There we go. All right. So we started here, all right? But before we even start a sentence, before we even get any information from the sentence, say, what color is the sun, how's the weather, before any of that, we immediately receive a timestamp many years later. And we skip forward to an unknown, distant future. And this is where we first see any image, which is the firing squad and the colonel. We have no idea what's going on here, but it's obviously not a very happy scene. It seems to indicate death. It seems to indicate an end to the story. But before we can even fully absorb what's going on here, hey, Garcia Marquez is not letting us stay here. Because the main character, the only character we know, is suddenly having a flashback. He has to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. Think about the implication of the last part. When one's father took him to discover ice, it implies curiosity. It implies innocence. So it implies childhood. What it means is, when the colonel is remembering the past, we didn't return to the beginning. No, we went way past that, all the way to the back, because somehow we assume that a childhood is way into the past. So you see, within one sentence, we went from the present to the future and immediately to the distant past. And that sets the tone for the novel, because it's 100 Years of Solitude and it's all about time. It's very cool. This is one of the greatest novels ever written. So if you haven't read it, you should. Now, I have that little diagram there. Let's explore a little bit. So imagine that time has a shape. We all have heard the phrase time's arrow. It goes forward. So most stories would have a shape like this. Has a beginning, has an ending to an end, goes one direction. But of course, we know that isn't true. Drama comes from the disparity of time. So even in a most traditionally written story, we would have things like this, where there would be a time skip in between. Even if it's as simple as the main character driving to the grocery store to pick something up, very likely the author is not going to describe that drive because it's boring. So the author is going to skip forward. So almost all traditionally written story will have a time arrow that goes forward to the future, but have multiple skips in between. But we can be more creative. Here we have a timeline that's mostly going forward, but you can see that it starts to diverge into different arrows that continue to go forward. A good example of this would be the Lord of the Rings trilogy. If you remember, from the Fellowship of the Ring, we mostly follow Frodo Baggins, and we see him having adventures and get saved in the Elf Kingdom, and then a bunch of heroes gather around and they form the Fellowship of the Ring. But at the end of that first film, the Fellowship got split. So now the camera follows not just Frodo, but also follows Pippin's group, and also follows Aragorn's group. That's how the structure is for the trilogy for the next two films. Even though all three storylines are happening at the same time and they all go forward at the same pace. All right. What about something like this, where we skip back and forth? We've seen a lot of stories that's set in an achronological structure. That means that author may not want to tell the story from beginning to the end. They'll pick something right in the middle, and then they may skip to another timeline, talk about maybe how his father was doing, and then they may skip back. So, for example, The Godfather Part 2 is a pretty good example of this, skipping between Michael Corleone and the Don from two different timelines, even though both timelines still go forward. And you can be more creative on top of this model. You can skip back, you can add a third line. You can be completely achronological. I recommend Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, which is probably one of the best examples of how to use achronological storytelling. In that novel, the main character slips in and out of time. So the main time is set in World War II, when he is experiencing the horror of the war as a young man. But throughout the novel, we see his married life, we see his childhood, we see how he becomes successful and becomes old and finally dies and attract dementia, get kidnapped by aliens. I know it gets pretty weird, and he's a sci-fi writer. He did get kidnapped by aliens. But all of these jumbled together, and it's a metaphor for just how chaotic and fragmented the world experience is. So it's one of the greatest anti-war novels ever written, Slaughterhouse-Five. All right, what about this one? We have a time arrow going forward, and then it has a little loop right in the middle. A good example of that may be Groundhog Day, the classic Bill Murray film, where the majority of the movie, you just see the time keep looping and looping and looping. Now, let me make it clear that it does not take a sci-fi concept to use this shape of time. Because for Groundhog Day, it could easily work if he is just stuck in the town and not stuck in time. It could be that there's just a big blizzard that he has to stay in the town for a long time. So he has to explore the town and keep finding out details from the townsfolk. It'll be a less interesting story, but the structure of the story is not affected. This loop is not just a loop in time, not the scientific concept of time, but the structure of the story, which we'll get to in just a second. One last example to show you the times arrow can go back. This has a great example from Martin Amis's novel. It's shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and the title is Time's Arrow. It starts at the ending of the novel, and time goes back. All right. So what do we get from all of those? Well, I think you probably got the sense. The shape of time is the structure of the story. The shape of time is the structure of the story. When a writer writes a story, we almost always manipulate the time in some way. We're carving a piece from the entire space-time of the universe and put them onto paper. And since we are already doing that, might as well as give ourselves more freedom when we're doing that. So anytime that you want to make a skip, that you want to go to a different timeline, that you want to go back, you want to repeat the same time over and over and over, feel completely free to do that. You are the writer. And that's not only a tip and trick for your writing, but the very soul of it, the foundation of drama. Let's take a look at it at an example here from Nobel Prize winner William Faulkner. His short story, A Rose for Emily. All right. So, in this story, the main narrator's pronoun is we. So it always goes, we have seen this, we have seen that. So it's implied that the entire townsfolk is the protagonist, is the main narrator. So these townsfolk are describing this peculiar lady from the town. Her name is Emily. It's a very typical Southern story. Emily is a dignified antebellum lady. But as the town is observing Miss Emily, they always see something odd about her. You know, she's not very social. She once had a lover, for example. You know, once her yard was smelling. You know, all sorts of really weird little anecdotes. So, because Faulkner tells the story achronologically, sometimes it goes forward, sometimes it goes all the way back, but there's a still sense of progression in the story, because within every time skip, he would reveal more information to allow you to complete the picture. And at the very end, the last segment of the story is the last part chronologically. So a good analogy is that this kind of story is not a squirrel. It doesn't go forward continuously. It's more like a jigsaw puzzle. The Faulkner is giving you one little piece at a time, and you as the reader has the responsibility of putting it all together. At the very end, I'm not going to spoil it, but there's a shock reveal. And when we complete the last piece of the puzzle, we finally understood what was going on in this story. You know, why is Miss Emily so peculiar? Why is she the way it is? And once you figure it out, it's clear as day. You feel like, why haven't I noticed it before? We haven't noticed because he is not giving us all the clues in order. Our brains are wired to think about cause and effect in a certain order. Cause comes before the effect. So if we are telling a story that switches the order of cause and effect, it will create mystery. Nearly all mystery books, nearly all murder, you know, whodunit books does it that way. You almost never see the murderer gets to work first, and then we follow it, you know, the murderer's entire steps, and then the detective comes up. You almost never see that, because that would give cause before effect. You know, the murderer kills the person, and the effect is that person is dead. Instead, we have the death up front, and we have to spend the book to figure out what the cause is. It's as simple as that. But in a literary fiction, we can break that concept up and use it a lot more creatively. Let's take a look at a counter example here. Back to the Future. All right. This is a sci-fi film, and it literally evolves around time travel. So Marty, starts his story at the present, then he accidentally gets transported into the past, where he has to make sure that his mom and dad still dates in that timeline so that he would continue to exist. And finally, he returns to the present, which turns out to not be his own present. So we can see here, this is the present timeline. Then he goes back to the past, and then he comes back, but he's slightly off. All right. So this is the structure of Back to the Future. But think about it. Is it really shaped like this? Could I not make it about time travel and have the same story structure? Of course. Because throughout the entire movie, we are following the story of Marty McFly. He never left our sight. Yes, he traveled to the past, but he could have easily traveled to Kansas. He could easily have traveled to Japan. And then he returns home and finds that things are a little different from home. It's still the same structure. So really, this movie, despite the time traveling concept, it's a very straightforward, very classic straight line. Well, then why is this so great? Doesn't this make a bland story? Not really. It's by Steven Spielberg, first of all, so he knows what he's doing. And he uses the classic storytelling to its best. We start with an exposition, goes into rising action, then have a climax, then falling action, and back to denouement. Look at how similar the second program is to our first diagram with the timeline. It just so happens that when Spielberg makes this movie, the rising action and climax and falling action all happen when Marty is in the past. So the emotional value of the story matches up with the shape of time. That's how he is able to make such a simple story into such a dramatic one. So I'm showing you this example to really make a point that, don't feel like you have to break the norm and tell a story non-traditionally to make it interesting. What I'm doing here today is really just to give you a new tool that you can apply in writing. All right. We're going to go to a different aspect of time. Well, so far we have been talking about the big theory of it. This is all just something interesting, food for thought, really. From starting the next slide, we're going to talk about time more in detail in the technique of it. So I'd like to take a short pause here. If you have any question, feel free to type into the Q&A section, something that's pressing, something that we have talked about so far. I can clarify that up. Yeah, if Miss Jamie and Miss Sabrina sees any question, please let me know. And if not, we can move forward. Just gonna wait for a minute or two.
Looks like we are all good right now.
Okay, very nice. Then we'll save all the questions towards the end. All right. Speeding up and slowing down. So when we're actually sitting down in front of a computer or in front of a writing pad and we start writing, then time becomes something much more different. We call that pacing. So we have always heard the phrase, "Oh, this novel seems a little slow for me," or "Oh, it reads very fast." Well, readers are referring to pacing there, and we can easily control it. This is a very straightforward chart. Let's take a quick look. If you want to speed things up, use shorter sentences. If you want to slow things down, you make sentences longer. It's as simple as manipulating the reader's attention span. If it's a short sentence, it's very easy for them to scan that sentence and take it in as a single pack of information. If it's longer, then they have to spend a little bit more energy on the relationships between clauses, and that will slow things down. If you want to make things faster, you want to make them rhythmic. If you want to slow them down, you may want to add more power to it, such as parallel sentences. That would have to force readers to process the emotional value in it. Pack less information in faster paragraphs. Sketch things, skip over details if you want things to be faster. Also, dialogues tend to be faster than narration because dialogues are a lot closer to how we actually speak in life. And it's a lot closer to how we are used to processing information because, we talk with people every day. When it's narration driven, it's a lot that we have to take into account, the author's writing level or the narrative voice of the main character if it's a first person novel. So there's that extra layer of information to unpack. When it's dialogue, it's a little bit faster. If it's action packed, it's faster, as opposed to someone having a long stream of consciousness meditation. If you have more transitions, it will create this sense of a montage scene. It goes from scene to scene to scene, as opposed to you have a long, continuous scene, then it will slow the reader down. If it has a higher tension, it will be faster. The reader can't wait to go to the next page, then they'll read a lot faster just to see what's gonna resolve the conflict at hand. And finally, if you have a straightforward story, it's going to be faster. If it has some embedded puzzle in it, if it's a mystery book, for example, or some other tricks, which I'm gonna show you in a moment, then it's going to be slower. Now, there's this concept called purple prose. It refers to a bit of very beautifully written prose that doesn't do anything. We want to avoid this kind of purple prose. Let me read you a passage to show you what I mean. The mahogany-haired adolescent girl glanced fleetingly at her rugged paramour, a crystalline sparkle in her eyes as she gazed happily upon his countenance. It was filled with an expression as enigmatic as shadows in the night. She pondered thoughtfully whether it would behoove her to request that she continue to follow him on his noble mission. That's a mouthful. Now, as you can see, this person does know how to write. There's some really nice vocabulary there, and there's a nice rhythm in the prose. Maybe this person should be a poet. But not a whole lot has happened in that scene. I went through the scene and I picked out the verbs, and turns out the only thing that happened is that a girl is looking at her lover. I was thinking whether she should follow him. That's it. And you can also see that this author has used a lot of vocabulary that replaces common nouns, such as, enigmatic. That can be puzzling. Or this person has written paramour, which is lover. So all of these extra vocab that's packed in here is slowing things down for a reader. But it doesn't have as much information in this passage, so the slowing down is not rewarding. If the writer wants to slow the reader down and show them how beautifully written it is, uh, the reader better get something out of it. So let's look at a counterexample. Because a good pace does not always mean a fast pace. It is totally not only acceptable, but expected for a slower passage to have some sort of impact and to be information packed. So let me read you another passage. On the third day of rain, they had killed so many crabs inside the house that Pelayo had to cross his drenched courtyard and throw them into the sea. Because the newborn child had a temperature all night, and they thought it was due to the stench. The world had been sad since Tuesday. Sea and sky were a single ash gray thing, and the sands of the beach, which on March nights glimmered like powdered light, had become a stew of mud and rotten shellfish. The light was so weak at noon that when Pelayo was coming back to the house after throwing away the crabs, it was hard for him to see what it was that was moving and groaning in the rear of the courtyard. He had to go very close to see that it was an old man, a very old man, lying face down in the mud, who, in spite of his tremendous efforts, couldn't get up, impeded by his enormous wings. That's once again from our friend Garcia Marquez. Is his signature short story, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. There's some scenery descriptions in there. We see how the sky and sea look. We smell the stench. It doesn't always tell a story. But from here, you see world building, which we talked about last time. You also see a lot of information that you wouldn't know, like crabs are filling the courtyard. That's a very unusual scene. Most importantly, it ends on a punch. This protagonist is already going through this very surrealistic scene with all the crabs invading the beach. And then he goes into the courtyard and see this old man with enormous wings, almost like an angel. This is the opening paragraph for that first story. Compare this with the purple prose example that we just shown. You would know, how to make an impactful, slow-paced prose. But there are other ways to write a slower story that's engaging. House of Leaves, for example, that's one of my all-time favorite books. It shows how the book actually works. And it slows readers down with puzzles. As you can see from this example here, some texts are written sideways, and it creates the illusion that you can see through the pages. It has lots of footnotes, and footnotes have footnotes, and sometimes the footnotes would lead you to the appendix and to the references at the end of the book. Sometimes it leads you to the publication page of the book. It's the epitome example of metafiction. And when I read this book, there's no way you can read from beginning to the end in one go. It's a puzzle-solving experience. And this book just so happens to be about a supernatural labyrinth. And as you're reading it, you're also going through a labyrinth of text. Here we have another author that we mentioned earlier today, Mr. Liu Cixin. His best-selling and award-winning trilogy, Remembrance of the Earth Past, which is also known as the three-body problem, utilizes this technique called macro detail. That's his own term, macro detail. So as opposed to just detail, for example, two characters are very near and you describe how the hair on their skin stands up, that's just detail. When we're talking about macro detail, we look at it from a larger period of time, of how human interaction and social changes occur within a longer period of time. For example, the Gutenberg printing press back in the 1440 has created a ripple effect across Europe. It made knowledge more available, and it has basically caused the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. So macro detail really is that a very careful thinking of cause and effect on the larger scale. You take the entire society as the scale and the entire time period as the scale, and think about how every event will lead to another event, no matter how small. When Mr. Liu wrote Death End, I mentioned that that novel covers the entire lifespan of the universe. That's how he did it. He, through various technology and literary devices, his characters would skip forward in time. And every time they skip forward, he would show what has changed within society or within the universe. And then he would give a reason for why the next time it's going to skip a lot further. During one skip, it really literally skipped through trillions of years. And the drama that comes from that scene is just impossible to describe. So if you haven't read this trilogy and you're a sci-fi reader, I highly recommend. So where to write slower, detailed scenes? Well, we can once again look at scientific concepts and give us some hints. Gravitational time dilation refers to how when you're going near a body with a large mass, time will slow down. Black holes are really heavy, so when you're going around black holes, time will slow down for you. You can spend maybe 2 seconds near a black hole, and when you come out of it, a few years have passed on Earth. Use that as a metaphor. If you're writing an important event in your story, or you're writing about an important character, something that has mass, that's when you want to slow things down and give them the attention that they deserve. Now, in practice, when we are looking at pacing on the sentence-to-sentence level, I always want to use this example. We can't read this often enough. Some of you may have already seen it, but it's always nice to review it. This sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more words. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together become monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drums. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands some variety. Now listen. I vary the sentence length and I create music. Music! The writing sings. It has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences, and I use sentences of medium length. And sometimes, when I am certain the reader is rested, I will engage him with a sentence of considerable length, a sentence that burns with energy and builds with all the impetus of a crescendo, the roll of the drums, the crash of the cymbals, sounds that say, listen to this. It is important. This is by writing coach Gary Prevost, and I think it's self-explanatory. Vary your sentence length. All right. I'm going to end on this slide. We have talked about a lot of things today, but they all evolve around time. So I made this slide that's just titled Elements of Time. On the left side, we have some concepts such as plot structure, which is just the shape of time. We have to consider the reader's experience time, or the time span in the fictional world, the pacing, the rhythm of synthesis, and how drama comes from disparity. On the right side, we have some of the techniques that we mentioned, including flashback and forward, transition, making puzzles, using macro detail to describe a historical period, write time as a concept, and use gravity as a metaphor of when to slow down. I recommend Alan Lightman's novel, Einstein's Dreams. Einstein's Dreams. It's a series of short episodic stories, quote unquote stories, of Einstein's how Einstein dreams what the time will look like. So it's a very interesting little metaphysical and philosophical novel where you see how in different society, how maybe sometimes time goes cyclical, maybe sometimes it freezes, just how people from those society may live. Now, I know this is all very nebulous, but I encourage you to keep thinking just like this. This is by no means a end all and tell all structure or a grand theory of how to write. This is just another way of thinking. And it's only by thinking creatively and pull unlikely concepts together can you become a great writer. If you just want to be a competent writer, there are plenty of books out there, plenty of videos online just like this one. But you can only make that step up by keep thinking and keep reading. So thank you for coming today. In a moment, I can answer some questions, but just very quickly, on the right side, I have the photo credits. And this is the Write workshop for November. This would conclude what we have for this season. I'm likely going to contact my colleagues at the library system to maybe get another session in the spring. And we're going to talk about, I'm thinking perhaps the science of information, how the element of surprise works in writing. Or I may talk about how to do some genre writing. I really haven't decided. If you have some suggestions, feel free to type it in a bit. Let me see. All of the handouts are going to be sent to you in a little bit. I would say maybe early next week. I don't know how Thanksgiving is going to affect our timeline. And be sure to check out our other programs from the Plano Library website or our social media. We have an online calendar where you can register for more programs like this. Okay. I'm going to end the lecture right here. But if you have any questions, I'm going to take a look right now. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all very much for coming. You guys are why I keep doing this. Yeah. And while we're waiting for some questions, probably gonna wait until the top of the hour. If you're looking to submit some stories, you may want to look to this platform called Submittable, as in submittable. Okay, thank you. So a lot of journals are using that as their online submission platform. And they also give you opportunities and advertisement for which journals are asking for drafts right now and which contests are on. Some of them may charge you a reading fee for up to $3. That is the industry norm. But if you're not too confident with your story just yet, there are plenty of free opportunities around. Just remember that literary journals, they're not the richest people on earth. So they tend not to pay you handsomely for a story. Most likely they'll send you a copy of their most recent journal, most recent issue, and that will be considered payment. What you want to do when you're submitting stories to these journals is to attract agents and publishers. So you want to make a really good story, submit it to as many journals as possible. And then if it gets published, someone will contact you and ask you, hey, do you have other writings available that you may want to send to other journals and getting published as a physical book? So that's how the process goes. All right. So it looks like we're not having a lot of questions today. In that case, we may just end it right now. I need to go eat something. Thank you all very much for joining our program today. And hopefully I'll see you guys in the spring. Everyone stay safe out there and have a great Thanksgiving. Have a great Christmas holiday season. Thank you. Bye-bye.